Hello, BookTube. It has recently come to my attention that I should probably do an essentials list for historical fiction. And so I have put together a list of the 15 or so works of historical fiction that are absolutely essential for you to read, both because some of them are groundbreaking, but also because some of them are just so good or so influential on lots of other writers who are writing historical fiction. And as with other genres or subgenres of fiction, it behooves us to ask a few questions first in categorical nature. What do we mean when we say historical fiction? I think there are a few things, a few distinctions that it might be helpful to draw. I, for instance, would prefer if historical fiction is taking place in the realm of documentation. I myself don't consider, for instance, a novel about Gilgamesh to be historical fiction, and so on and so forth. A novel, many novels, I've read many novels about, for instance, Noah's flood, which, just for the purposes of clarification, did not happen. Noah's flood did not happen. Nothing like it happened. Nothing like it could possibly have happened. Nevertheless, there are a lot of really good novels in or around the time of Noah's flood. I'd like to rule those out too. Whatever they are, historical fantasy or fantasy just in general, they aren't historical fiction. I like historical fiction to be moored to an actual documentable historical time, at least, and some historical events, at least. That's one demarcation of category that we can do. Another would be to ask what counts as historical fiction. The Historical Novel Society says, I think wisely, that it's historical fiction if the preponderance of the plot takes place at least 50 years before the publication of the book. I might add a quibble there. I like that rule, and when I worked for the Historical Novel Society, I used that rule all the time. I would get submissions from authors all the time and say, I'm sorry, this doesn't qualify. It's too recent. You can't write a historical novel, for instance, about 9/11. Even though a lot of people listening to me right now were not born when the attacks on 9/11 happened, or were little children. Still. And a corollary to that I might add is that I get a little suspicious when someone writes historical fiction about an event in which they took place, in which they took part, in which they were a direct witness. It doesn't rule things out, but that always makes me think maybe this is, that there's some element going on here other than historical fiction. I guess what I'm saying is that I prefer it when it's imagined out of whole cloth. But as you'll see in the list, that is not true in a lot of the examples that I'm giving. Another slight qualification on my part is, again, maybe it creeps a little into the realm of historical fantasy or reconstructed history, fictionalized history. I don't know in my own mind whether or not to call some of those things historical fiction. The biographies of Harold Lamb, for instance, his book on Alexander the Great, whatnot. There's a hefty amount of imagining being done there it's grounded on fact, but it seems to want to be a hybrid of biography and fiction. In this category, I might also include The French Revolution by Thomas Carlyle, and those make me queasy, so I have avoided them. In a longer list, if this were 100 books, maybe some of those would be on there. But instead, I'm trying to go with meat and potatoes historical stuff and the best of the best, so that you know what to read. So that if you really like historical fiction, and all you read is stuff that's at the library and there is no provenance, you will know what to hunt down, what to find. And we'll start with a series of books. This, like other essentials kits that I give you here, this will include series of books under one heading, sometimes. And the first one I want to start with is the Aubrey and Maturin novels of Patrick O'Brian, here in a box set that I had once upon a time and have never found again in the wild. Never. I have looked many times. There was a frustrating year, a whole year, at my local used bookstore, the Brattle Bookshop, where we found 4 of these 5 volumes. They weren't in a box, but we found 4 of the volumes. And the 5th one was not in the shop anywhere. It was not anywhere in the piles and boxes of books in the basement. We waited long enough, searched long enough so that we know that's not true. Somebody actually sold to the prattle 4 out of 5 of these volumes. But nevertheless, this series starts with Master and Commander. This is a series of Napoleonic seafaring adventures starring a British naval officer named Jack Aubrey and his close friend Stephen Matron, who is both a surgeon and a spy. And they form an unlikely friendship. One is the ultimate landlubber and something of a rarefied estate, and the other is a pink-faced, piratical British sea officer. They form a close friendship anyway, and the first book is Master and Commander, and the series goes on from there. And I am not recommending just Master and Commander. I'm recommending the whole series. The whole series is brilliant. Just brilliant. Historical fiction doesn't get much better than this, or most of the stuff on this list. There are a couple of items on this list that may not be good, technically speaking, but they are too important for you to miss. Then we'll move from one naval war to another. This is World War II, which shows up on this list a few times. This is The Cruel Sea by Nicholas Montserrat, about a beleaguered little ship in the British Navy that is at the very beginning of the war trying to shepherd convoys. An all-important task for an island kingdom, trying to shepherd convoys across oceans that were teeming with U-boat packs. And it's an amazing character study. It captures the feel of moments of warfare, definitely. But it's not meant to be sweeping or panoramic. It's much more of a character study and infinitely rereadable. Infinitely. Then we'll go to something that strains the boundaries of what I'm talking about when I say that your book, your historical fiction, should be about history and not about mythology. This book is very good. It's very passionate and involving. It is set in a historical period. It's Dear and Glorious Physician by Taylor Caldwell, with its great classic old cover. This is her novel about St. Luke. His experiences, what he researched in order to write the Gospel according to St. Luke and Acts. And the reason I sound so hesitant, this is Taylor Caldwell at her full flood. I know that a lot of her less biblically charged historical fiction gets, it once upon a time had a greater spotlight, but I think this is a more effective book. I think when she was writing about things that she really, really cared about in her historical fiction, rather than trying to present an opulent Kent Family Chronicles style tapestry, when she's writing about things she really cares about, I think it shows in the prose. It definitely does in this. And St. Luke almost certainly did not exist. Certainly not as the character that Christianists confidently talk about. I've read Christian exegesis and Christian apologists who write about, oh yeah, well, of course St. Luke would mention that since, he was a doctor. All of that is church myth. All of that is folklore. We know nothing about the author of St. Luke. Of the Gospel of St. Luke. But this imagines first century Judea, first century Rome and all abouts, and does a really effective job, really involving job, in a way that is an important element of historical fiction. An important element of historical fiction is you're going to be tiptoeing around long settled subjects, whether they're religious or not, on which people have deep piled opinions. And if you're a writer worth your salt, you're going to be throwing a little bit of chaos into that settled complacency. Then we have a novelist who, if this list were 100 books long, everything, his major 3 or 4 books would be on here. But I chose his best one, his strangest one, and again, his most passionate one. This is Entered from the Sun by George Garrett, a great writer who is now unfortunately forgotten. And this is his novel about Christopher Marlowe. It's tiny compared to his other historical novels, but it is brilliant. Weird and refractory. You keep waiting for Marlowe to be the main character in his own book, and it so seldom happens, and you end up not minding. Winding its way in passages that grow more and more beautifully written and also hallucinatory to an incredible ending. To the last 50 pages of this book are the best 50 pages in this book. I know that I shouldn't make a big deal out of that, but no one knows how to end books anymore. So I do make a big deal of it. Then we move to the American West. The American Old West, I think, has been the subject of more historical novels than any other period in human history. I think it's had probably a million books written about it, a million novels written about it. The reason that it doesn't come quickly to mind, the two things that come quickly to mind are the Tudors and Rome, ancient Rome. The reason it doesn't come quickly to mind is because 99.999% of those million novels were terrible. Absolutely terrible. They were written in half an hour, and it reads that way. But nevertheless, Western novels do come up, right? They will come up on a list like this. For instance, hovering over this whole list is Lonesome Doubt by Lyman Chronicles, which I didn't put on this list because I'm assuming it goes without saying. I've mentioned the book ad nauseum. But I mentioned this book quite a bit too. This is Epitaph by Mary Doria Russell, her book about the gunfight at the OK Corral, which is a weirdly signature event in Wild West history. I think the treatises have been written on why this fascinates the imagination so much. Why so many writers over the years have unironically referred to the gunfight at the OK Corral as Homeric, which is a little bit hard to take. The motives are a little bit murky. The whole thing lasted 15 minutes. Eyewitness accounts are drastically at odds with each other. And here, Mary Doria Russell writes it with poetic diction. This is one of the most beautifully written books on this list. So to the point where it doesn't really matter that it's about the OK Corral. Her book on Wyatt Earp was every bit as eloquent. It's just this has a little more of a central idea to pull it together, and it's brutal, violent, and lovely. So I don't think the Old West makes many appearances on this list. I know that a lot of people will howl about Lonesome Doubt, but I mean it to be included. But anyway, we're going to move on to other things that are essential. Like, for instance, one of the kinds of historical romance that you get, there are all kinds. One is a searching inquiry. One is a psychological study. We have plenty of those on this list. Another is a romp. There are historical novels that are romps. Whether they are meant sarcastically and very subversively, like, for instance, The Saltweed Factor by John Barth, or whether they're meant just to be a rollicking, fun time, like, for instance, Jem and Sam by former TLS editor Ferdinand Mount. Romps are an essential part of historical fiction. Some people that I've known in my life have loved historical fiction, but only historical fiction romps. They don't want to read anything else, nothing more pointed than that. And when it comes to historical fiction romps, there's hardly any that can hold a candle, unless you go back to canonical works like Tom Jones. There's hardly any that holds a candle to Forever Amber by Kathleen Winsor. This is about a feisty young woman in the court of King Charles, the merry monarch, and all of her various adventures with both anonymous characters and also a whole bunch of characters from the Restoration that you will know. You will recognize them if you know the period. And it's sudsy and wonderful, and I think largely tongue-in-cheek, just delightful. Sold billions of copies over its lifespan as a book. I think it might still be in print. But no one remembers it anymore. No one thinks about it anymore. But I highly, highly recommend it. Then we move on to, this isn't exactly a romp, and this is a translated work. There are a couple of translated works on this list. This is The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Notre Dame de Paris by Victor Hugo, in which the author imagines Notre Dame Cathedral centuries before his time and writes what in many ways is the apotheosis of a tearjerker plot. This author wrote other historical fiction, of course, but this is his most tightly controlled and most effective. It's hard to imagine a reader who won't have their heartstrings tugged by the fates of some of these characters, including especially the central character, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, Quasimodo. So regardless of, once again, because it's a work in translation, I would urge you to find a few different translations and see which one you like. There isn't much variation between the translations of this, I don't think, so you might be lucky in your first try. Then this next one is two books. I mean it to be two books. I'm only showing you the cover to one. This is Robert Graves' book, I, Claudius, which was followed by his sequel, Claudius the God. He wrote a sequel because he had a lot of other stories to tell. He wanted to tell the story of the Emperor Claudius, the Roman Emperor Claudius, as emperor. He also wanted to tell the story of first century Judea. uh, which disastrously Claudius the God does. The sequel to I, Claudius splits its narrative between, as one critic put it, a vast amount of territory and characters about which readers do not care at all, and a vast amount of territory and characters about which readers care very much, which is not exactly a winning recipe for a book. But the parts of Claudius the God that are good are great. And this tells the story, as Graves imagined it, of the unlikely Emperor Claudius, who, according to Suetonius, was found cowering behind a curtain by the Praetorian Guard and made emperor once they'd killed all the other claimants. Graves wrote I, Claudius. It immediately took off. It was an immediate hit, even before the great BBC production. And certainly his biographers, and Graves himself, might say that he wrote Claudius the God in order to continue the story, capitalize on that financial windfall, and tell about Claudius changing. Claudius changes when he's emperor, a great line in Claudius the God, where he says, having started with the best of intentions, I find that I have killed 17 people. It would only be carping cynics like yours truly who would say that Claudius the God was written entirely so that Robert Graves could write the foreword in which he yells at the critics of I, Claudius, who said that it was largely just cribbed from Suetonius. Either way, this takes getting used to. The writing in I, Claudius and Claudius the God takes getting used to. It is not particularly inviting, but it's engrossing after a while, once you do get used to it. You'll get used to it pretty quick in I, Claudius, and then Claudius the God will punish you a bit because you're going to have a lot to get through in Claudius the God that you'll be asking every 5 pages, why should I be interested in this? You're writing with lots of energy and obvious intelligence, but why should I be interested in this? And that's a question that Claudius the God never quite answers. There are a couple of other books on this list where that question is never quite answered. Then this next one could be said to have started historical fiction as a subgenre of fiction, just as a recognizable thing, as opposed to the general all-purpose romance, when that did not mean what we think of romance novels. And this is Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. The story of a knight, an errant warrior, a pure soul, and the 2 women who love him under King Richard. It is easily parodyable, definitely, and talk about it. A kind of diction that requires a little getting used to. But Ivanhoe still has the power to enchant. I know this for a fact. I reread it periodically, trying to keep myself a million miles distant from it to figure out what the present generation will think of it. And I honestly do believe that someone born in the year 2000 who is coming to Ivanhoe completely fresh in a new and depraved century will like it. I honestly do believe that. I think it is still effective. I'm putting it on this list as opposed to a lot of other stuff that Sir Walter Scott wrote, because a lot of that other stuff I think is dead. There's a magic in Ivanhoe, I think, that keeps it alive. Then we have a little bit of an idiosyncratic choice. This would not be on many people's list. I think it's terrific, and this is my list after all, but it is essential. It is terrific. It is better than a lot of historical fiction that mines its same vein that you might read without knowing this book exists. So I want to bring it to your attention. Most of these things I've talked about on this channel before. This is The Journeyer by Gary Jennings. This is the story of Marco Polo. This is a novel about Marco Polo and his uncles who voyage all the way to the court of the Khan and encounter all sorts of marvels and wonders along the way and while they're there. So although I technically might have been able to include Marco Polo's own book on this list, this I certainly can. Because here the author is getting inside the thoughts and emotions, inside periods of Marco Polo's life that we don't know anything about, including his boyhood in Venice. This has some real set pieces in it. This author really has a talent for set pieces when he puts his mind to it. There's a set piece in which a young Marco Polo is almost captured and sold into slavery. And the process by which he will be prepared, he almost goes through the whole of it, and it is horrific to read on the page, just grippingly horrifying. Also, there's a scene later in the book where a combination of, I guess, psychotherapy and drugs allows Marco Polo to go on a journey where no man has gone before. He simulates childbirth. He feels what it's like to give birth. And it goes on and on, far longer than any man is going to want it to, that's for sure. And there's a climactic scene where our heroes, Marco Polo and his allies at the court of the Khan, use gunpowder in a very effective and spectacular way. Just a wonderful, heartfelt book that I don't think is in print anymore, but well worth your time. Far more worth your time, in fact, than Gary Jennings now has written a few sequels to his book Aztec. They are less effective. All of those things and the original Aztec are less effective than Journeyer. So I'd stick with that if you want to read any Gary Jennings. Not that I think only Aztec is in print. Then we have an author who wrote historical fiction in his own life, all of his career, but almost never cared about it. Believe it or not. And that sounds like a contradiction. Almost never cared about it, and cared about it less the more he did it. What I'm going to show you is an early example and a very good example, probably the best example. This is Julian by Gore Vidal. And this is about Julian the Apostate, a late Roman emperor who tried in vain to return the empire to the worship of its old pantheon of gods and away from Christianity. And suffered for it. May even, if you read squint between the lines when you're reading the sources, may even have been killed for it by so-called friendly fire. And Vidal fills this with erudition. Weird, wonky erudition, but erudition. This is one of a few books on this list that bears direct comparison with I, Claudius, not just in the manner of execution, but also in the fact that the success of I, Claudius was very much on the minds of the people who tried to recapture that success. This is wonderful. Just wonderful. And I can't say that about... Gore Vidal wrote probably 15 historical novels after this one. And I can't say that about all of them. I can't even say that about most of them. Then we have something, Good Lows, I've recommended this on this channel many, many times. This is The Killer Angels by Michael Shara. This is his book about the Battle of Gettysburg. The 4 days of the Battle of Gettysburg, where the forces of the North and the South in the American Civil War encountered each other in a small junction town without really expecting anything. The encounter was a little bit by accident, and the fight that developed was a little bit by accident. It's just that both armies were in the vicinity and started to apply more and more force to this one little pinch point. And so a major battle, in what became the crucial battle of the American Civil War, ended up being fought on this territory, which neither army would have picked, and which either army would have used in different ways than they did. You have conflicting forces here. You have the Southern Army being led by Robert E. Lee at a point where he and his men, despite a lack of personnel and material, have won a lot of impressive victories against far greater forces, to the point where not only do the men feel that they're invincible, but Lee feels like he has the measure of his northern opponents. And on the other side is the northern forces being led by General Meade, who had just got the job. Didn't know the land. He knew Pennsylvania, but he didn't know the lay of full-scale warfare like this. Certainly didn't know Robert E. Lee. And this is the story of the battle that those two armies fight. Now, in reality, there was never any doubt, never any doubt whatsoever about the outcome of Gettysburg. At the back of General Meade was 150,000 fresh men who'd been training and drilling and being given fine meals and fine equipment for a couple of years without ever seeing combat, without ever being called or needed at the front lines. And back of General Lee, there was nothing. Nothing at all. Just nothing at all. The guys that he could see with his eyes were everything that he had. The food that they could scavenge from the land was as much as they could get or ever expect. So there was never any doubt, but it doesn't matter. It's not who's going to win or who wins that matters in this book. It's how gorgeously this is done. Totally involving. The best American Civil War novel, and also one of the best examples of historical fiction in American literature. Then we have this winner of a Nobel Prize. There aren't many Nobel Prize winners on this list for very good reason. This is Kristin Lavransdatter by Sigrid Undset. And once again, we are talking about more than one book. This is the cover to the Penguin Classic Deluxe Edition, which is lovely. This is about medieval Norway and the internecine bloody struggles between families in these distant, cold dells and fjords and whatnot. It's lovely. It evokes the natural world in a beautiful way. It evokes its characters in a beautiful way that is was intended by its author to be very reminiscent of the Icelandic sagas, I think. It's therefore a weird, strange reading experience, one unlike anything else on this book. And you should read all of the books. You shouldn't read just the first one. Speaking of reading all of the books, oh my God, all right, well, I'm loading you down with a lot of reading, but only because I despise shortcuts. And this next one is the Lyman Chronicles by Dorothy Dunnett, which starts with the Game of Kings and goes on. And you should not just read the Game of Kings. You should read all of these books. Dorothy Dunnett is not as well known in this country, not as well favored as I would like. I think she's far more revered in the UK. Believe you me, when you encounter someone who loves her work, whether it's this or she wrote a series of books set in the Italian Renaissance, when you encounter someone who knows these works and is a fan of them, their whole face will change when you mention it. Their eyes will light up. There's a reason for that. These are wonderfully, wonderfully done. And they follow one main character throughout a large part of these books, but they branch out, obviously, as a huge series will do. And well worth it. Huge, sprawling cast of secondary characters, all of them brought marvelously to life. Okay, then another huge book. Another one that I have my issues with how this is presented and how it has been memorialized in English. This is a work of translation. This is Musashi by Eiji Yoshikawa. This is a gigantic work that is treated strangely. This is about, the feudal era Japan, the era of the heyday of the samurais, and it has gigantic, epic plot lines that run all throughout. The author is in complete control of those plot lines. I think this is a gigantic, towering masterpiece. And yet, where are the editions? I don't know. When is the last time this was translated into English? This is the cover of a big, weird, square, oversized hardcover edition that forever and ever was the only hardcover that you could get. As far as I know, it might still be the only hardcover that you can get of this book. Once upon a time, there was a set of mass-market paperbacks. I don't remember if they were the same translation as this. But where in the 21st century is Musashi? I don't know. But this is enthralling. I had a spot on this list. I was going to decide whether or not to include this or Shogun by James Clavell. I've talked about Shogun a lot on this channel, and also this is better. So I included this instead. Because this is my list, right? Even though these are essential. This is still my list. Then, you remember what I said, what I've said about a couple of books now, or implied about a couple of books now, that at some point in their length, and they're always long, you'll be down a rabbit hole, you'll be down an odd detour, and you'll be asking yourself, okay, but I mean, this is wonderfully done, but why am I reading this? What does this have to do with anything? That doesn't mean those books aren't worth reading. It doesn't even detract from their brilliance. But it can happen in historical fiction, more so, I think, than any other kind of fiction. You couldn't write a Western where you did that. You couldn't write a horror novel where you did that. You can definitely do that in historical fiction, mainly because historical fiction is always working against the inherent inbuilt demon of info dumping. This next book, you'll definitely have passages where you want it. This is The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, about a medieval monastery and horrifying, bizarre, book-obsessed murders that are taking place there, and the monk who goes in to try and figure out what's going on. Unfortunately for first-time readers of this book, one of those enormous digressions, one of those enormous indulgences on the part of the author happens right away in this book, happens within the first 30 or 40 pages, and goes on for what feels like 1,000 pages. So, unfortunately, that quality that I'm talking about, where you will go down a dark wood and you will ask yourself, okay, why am I reading this? It's engaging, but why am I reading this? Is this going to be on the test? Does this connect with anything? Unfortunately, one of those happens right at the beginning of this book. And this book has not lacked for readers, that's for sure. So I'm not saying it's hurt the book, but I wonder how many more readers it would have if that hadn't been there. All I can say about this is persevere, because it is brilliant, and we'll reward your perseverance. Then we have something, this is an author, I could have included a lot of these books in a longer list, I would, but here I'm including her greatest book. This is The Persian Boy by Mary Renault. And this is a story of Alexander the Great and his best friend, love of his life, Hephaestion, but also Bagoas. a beautiful little eunuch who comes into Alexander's train and teaches him a whole bunch of things about how men can love other men. And through Bagoas, we see all of Alexander's campaigns. We see all of his personal betrayals, his personal upheavals, everything. All done wonderfully. Just absolutely wonderfully. Again, as with Name of the Rose, and maybe a couple of other books on this list, there's a make or break beginning to this thing. Before you get to the meat of the story, you get a very brief sledgehammer to the face scene about how Bagoas became a eunuch and was sold into slavery. And Mary Renault does not look away. She does not put any euphemisms in there. So you're going to have to get through that moment in order to get where you want to go. But oh my, what a book once you get there. Then an author who is far better known for only one of his books. It happens with authors, and sometimes lightning just strikes. There's nothing you can do about that. You'll be lucky if you have a good deal with your publisher. That's all. And it'll make sense if you write sequels. John Jakes, for instance, the author of The Bastard, the first book in the Kent Family Chronicles, he had no idea whether or not The Bastard would catch on. It was published at exactly the right historical moment in American history, and it did catch on massively. Even before, again, just like with Claudius, it caught on massively even before there was a gigantically popular TV miniseries. But Jakes didn't know that when he wrote the book. He spent the next 15 years writing sequels, but he didn't know that he was going to do that. It's rare that sequels or follow-ups in a line like that will be as good as the original. In this case, I think one of the follow-ups is actually better. The author here is James Jones, who is the author of From Here to Eternity, and this is his book, The Thin Red Line, about a company of soldiers, hapless soldiers, in the Battle of Guadalcanal. And they are not the usual recruitment poster group. They're all kinds of different weirdos in this group, including a full-blown psychopath. And it's all wonderfully described. Guadalcanal was a meat grinder of a battle. It was hellish conditions, even without the shooting, even without the booby traps and the bombs and whatnot. And it blurs a couple of lines that I was talking about at the beginning about categories, because Guadalcanal, of course, was in James Jones's own lifetime, and also he participated in it. So ordinarily, I would feel a little queasy about including a book like this, because to what extent is this not a memoir? But this is brilliant. That was no doubt in my mind to include it. It is far, far better than From Here to Eternity. Far more brutal. And less, saccharine or whatever. Then we're going to do another translated French work. The French were big on historical fiction. And were writing it long before it actually had that official subgenre name, that distinction. And this is, if The Hunchback of Notre Dame is an example of that, if that is well known to you, this will be even more well known to you. So well known that I worry that you won't have actually read it. This is The Three Musketeers by Alexander Dumas. This is the, I don't know if you can make it out there, the Lawrence Ellsworth translation, which is from Pegasus Books, I believe, in the U.S., and is incredible. Far, far better than any other translation of Three Musketeers. So well worth your time. It's a great big book. Don't know if it's in paperback. I imagine that it is. I wonder if I'm blurbed on the paperback. But I've been singing Ellsworth's praises for his translation of Dumas for a long time, and his translation of Three Musketeers did not disappoint me. Some nitpicking critics had problems with it, but you can safely ignore them. I'm telling you, not only to read The Three Musketeers as historical fiction, especially if you've taken it for granted and never read it, but also to read this translation. I ordinarily don't just prescribe a translation, because the whole point is that you should get comfortable with whatever translation you're using. In this case, I'd say try this one first. I bet you'll like it. Then talking about translated work, and also talking about something that is canonical, and yet is historical fiction, we will go with the biggie, War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. This is an old Signet paperback. It says New American Translation. I think this is Anne Donegan who does this translation, but no matter who it is, Tolstoy is definitely not a case where I'm prescribing a translation. Here I'm saying pick a bunch of translations and go with the one that you like the most. But this is historical fiction. It was Tolstoy trying to reimagine a lost era. And it's gigantically sprawling and incredible. It's absolutely incredible. I know War and Peace is kind of a meme in the 21st century for just this impossibly big and imposing and intimidating work, uninviting. But I guarantee you, War and Peace is not uninviting at all. It's tremendously inviting. And don't just take my word for it. Find anybody who's actually read this and ask them, okay, was it a chore? That's the last thing on earth, they'll say. So I wanted to include that. And then we'll finish up with Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. And here I do want to include this as one book in a series. When this came out, won every award that wasn't nailed down, was universally praised, is brilliant. It deserved its universal praise. You can't always trust universal praise. For instance, McKinley Cantor's Andersonville, his American Civil War novel, Andersonville, was universally praised, and it's deadly dull. Just an awful brick of a book with not a single breath of life in it. But Wolf Hall was universally praised. It's the only book on this list that was praised by both Christopher Hitchens and myself. And it is brilliant. It does deserve that universal praise. But its follow-up novels, Bring Up the Bodies and The Mirror and the Light, are also brilliant. So here I would, like with a couple of other books on this list, I would ideally urge you to read them all. So anyway, that is a list of essentials of historical fiction. And who knows what we'll do next? We'll have to wait and see. Thank you, BookTube.